Welcome to Grateful, where we provide one-on-one online SAT, ACT, and PSAT tutoring to students all around the world. Our approach is rooted in the idea that the SAT is a content-based test. Unlike the older SAT, that was more of an IQ test. Here, there are very concrete things that you need to know and also approaches that you need to take in order to get your best score. Right now, we're going through SAT Practice Test 2's reading section, and we're going to discuss the best approaches for handling every one of the questions. The best way to take advantage of this video is to find SAT Practice Test 2 from College Board or Khan Academy's website, try the questions on your own, and then refer to this video for instructions on how to do the questions. You can also pause the video at each question, try the question on your own, and then look at our solution. Before we get started, let's just talk a little bit about our general approach to SAT reading. In addition to regular reading, which you've been doing your whole life, and of course we're not here to show you how to do it, we also recommend two special styles of reading. One is the skipping words method, and the other is the focusing on verbs method. In general, when you first approach a reading passage, you should read it as quickly as possible, just trying to get the main ideas, taking no longer than a minute to first read through the passage. From our experience, the vast majority of issues that students encounter on the reading section has to do with trying too hard in the beginning. Once you get that initial read of the passage and that initial take on the main idea, view the questions that you're doing as opportunities to get to know the passage better. This works best if you're willing to skip questions here and there if you encounter a question too early that requires a really deep understanding of the passage. After you've gone through other questions and used those questions as an excuse to get to know the passage better, eventually a moment will come where you'll feel more prepared to handle some of those tougher questions. When you do your first read of a passage, usually we're going to want you to use the skipping words method. In this method, you just go ahead and focus on the words that seem like they're most important, trusting that your mind can tell which words are more important and which ones are less important. What we're talking about when we mention all this is your mind's inner monologue. You only want your inner monologue to pronounce certain key phrases as you're reading, and we'll model this when we read through. This works well because there's another part of your mind, a little bit of a more unconscious part of your mind, that's actually reading everything. If that weren't the case, then how would we really decide what is more and less important? But since you're not allowing yourself to read out every one of these words that's in the passage in your mind's inner monologue, you're saving a lot of time. To do this, you have to be willing to not really feel like you totally understand every single thing. As you go through the questions later, that knowledge of the passage will get better. What we're doing overall is we're being realistic about the fact that it takes a while to get familiar with a passage, just like it takes a while to get to know a new person who you just met. So usually, on your first take of a passage, you want to use the skipping words method. That's generally what we'll want on most easier passages. On an SAT reading section, there might be a few harder passages in there, and for those, you're going to want to start with the other method. That's the focusing on verbs method. Here, it'll take a little longer because you need to identify every verb you're seeing as you're seeing it. Verbs are really critical because they are like neon signs that point you to the most important things that are being said. So, on the tougher passages, we'll start with that method. On the easier passages, we'll start with the skipping words method. Regardless of which method we started with, as you're answering questions, when you get to something that's really, really tough to handle, your go-to in that situation is to focus on verbs. You'll notice, and we'll demonstrate this, that focusing on verbs is going to take you to the true definition of what's being said. That's not a matter of opinion. This is the thing that's going to allow you to differentiate when you get to that moment where there seem like there are more than one right answer. We'll help you focus on the verbs and get that one and only one right answer. That's the right answer on the SAT. Now, a quick word on what it means to focus on verbs. We all know that there are basic verbs that are action words. These are words like run, punch, and jump. But there are smaller verbs. These are words that are referred to as linking verbs. These words are is, was, are, am, were, be, have, has, had. Little verbs that we normally don't notice very often. Not only are these the most common verbs you're ever going to see, but they're also quite easy to ignore. If it is true that focusing on verbs is a secret to success on the SAT, then you need to know which words seem like verbs but are actually not. And that's your ing words. So run, punch, and jump are verbs, but running, punching, and jumping are not verbs. And also your to-do words. So run, punch, jump are verbs, but to run, to punch, and to jump are not verbs. So as the example that we commonly give, I might say, I like muffins, or I might say, I like running, or I like to run. Notice that running and to run are not being used as verbs in that sentence. The verb is the word like. They're actually being used as nouns, just like muffins. We'll get deeper into all of this as we go ahead and go through SAT Practice Test 2's reading section. We're going to go ahead and start reading through the reading section using the skipping words method, where we trust in our mind's unconscious ability to differentiate which words are more important and less important. We're not afraid of missing something because we're going to be coming back quite often. In fact, we never want to pick an answer on the SAT reading section unless we can point to the specific line or phrase that's responsible for that answer choice. We always want to read the introduction at the beginning. This passage is from Charlotte Bronte, The Professor, 1857. Because this passage was written in 1857 and the writing does look a little difficult to me, I'm personally right on the fence as far as whether to focus on verbs in the first read or to skip words. However, we're going to skip words because we know we're going to have plenty of chances to come back and focus on verbs as we're answering individual questions. So let's go ahead and start reading. No man likes to acknowledge that he's made a mistake in the choice of his profession. Every man worthy of the name will row against the wind and tide before he allows himself to cry, I'm baffled, and submits to be floated passively back to land. From the first week of my residence, I felt my occupation irksome. The work of copying and translating, was a dry and tedious task enough, but had that been all, I should have borne with the nuisance. I'm not impatient and influenced by the double desire of getting my living and justifying myself and others the resolution I had taken to become a tradesman. I should have endured, in the silence, the rust and cramp of my best faculties. I should not have whispered that I longed for liberty. I should have pent in every sigh by which my heart might have ventured to intimate its distress under the closeness, smoke, monotony, and tumult of Big Ben Close, and its panting desire for freer and fresher scenes. I should have set up the image of duty, perseverance in my small bedroom, and they too should have been my household gods, from which my darling, my cherished and secret imagination should never, either by softness or strength, have severed me. But this was not all. The antipathy which had sprung between myself and my employer excluded me from every glimpse of the sunshine of life, and I began to feel like a plant growing in humid darkness out of the slimy walls of a well. Antipathy is the word which can express the feeling Crimsworth had for me, a feeling which was liable to be excited by every movement of mine. My accent annoyed him. My education, language irritated him. My punctuality, industry, accuracy fixed his dislike and gave it the relish of envy. He feared that I should one day become a successful tradesman. Had I been inferior to him, he would not have hated me so thoroughly, but I knew all he knew. What was worse, he suspected that I kept silence on mental wealth in which he was no sharer. If he could once have placed me in a ridiculous position, he would have forgiven me, but I was guarded by caution, tact, observation. Prowling and prying as was his malignity, it could never baffle the lynx eyes of my natural sentinels. Day by day, his malice watched my tact, hoping it would sleep, prepared to steal snake-like on its slumber, but tact never sleeps. I had received my first quarter's wages, was returning to my lodgings, possessed with the pleasant feeling that the master who had paid me grudging every penny, I had long ceased to regard him as my brother. He wished to be an inexorable tyrant, that was all. Thoughts, not varied but strong, occupied my mind. Two voices spoke within me. Again they uttered the same monotonous phrases. One said, "Your life is intolerable." The other, "What can you do to alter it?" I walked fast. As I approached my lodgings, I turned from a general view of my affairs to the particular speculation as to whether my fire would be out. Looking toward the window of my sitting room, I saw no cheering red gleam. So here we have a fairly depressing story about someone who took a job and is dealing with a really difficult relationship with his boss, who seems to hate him simply out of jealousy. Question 1 is a question that's asking for the main idea of the whole passage. This is exactly the question that we might want to take our time on if we were really doing this in a real SAT setting, because at this moment we may not know so much about the passage. So we might want to take advantage of doing other questions as opportunities to get to know the passage better, and then come back to this one. But for the purpose of this video, we'll be doing the questions in order, of course. We can already answer this question in our own words. It's about a worker who suffers because his boss hates him. That right there can get rid of one answer choice C, because choice C says he's regretting privately a choice that he defends publicly. And we're not seeing anywhere that he's defending publicly the choice to take this job. All three of the other answer choices can all somewhat relate to how we answered it in our own words. A worker suffers because his boss hates him. So let's get a little deeper. Let's go ahead and look through the passage focusing on verbs. No man likes to acknowledge that he has made a mistake in his profession. Every man will row against the wind before he allows himself to cry, I am baffled, and submits to be floated back to land. From the first week of my residence, I felt my occupation irksome. The thing itself, the work, was a dry and tedious task enough, but had that been all, I should have borne with the nuisance. I am not of an impatient nature, and influenced by the desire of getting my living, and so on, the resolution I had taken to become a tradesman. I should have endured in silence the rust and cramp of my best faculties. I should not have whispered that I longed for liberty. I should have pent in every sigh by which my heart might have ventured to intimate its distress under the closeness, smoke, monotony, and joyless tumult of Big Ben Close. I should have set up the image of duty, the fetish of perseverance in my bedroom at Mrs. King's lodgings, and they should have been my household gods, from which my darling imagination should never have severed me. But this was not all. The antipathy which had sprung up between myself and my employer excluded me from every glimpse of the sunshine of life, and I began to feel like a plant growing in humid darkness out of the walls of a well. So, in the beginning, we have a sentence that's very philosophical. No man likes to acknowledge that he's made a mistake. Then we get into the story itself. From the first week, I felt my occupation irksome. It was a dry and tedious task. Had that been all, I should have borne with the nuisance. I should have endured. I should not have whispered. I should have pent in every sigh. I should have set up duty. Those things should have been my household gods. So right there, we're seeing a lot of I should have done this, I should have done that, a lot of expressions of regret. Getting into here now, this was not all. The antipathy between myself and my employer excluded me from the sunshine of life. I began to feel like a plant growing in darkness out of a well. So, going back again, we have the philosophical statement in the beginning that what does a man do when the man feels regret? How does a man deal with it? And then we have a lot of regret about the fact that work wasn't going well. The narrator says, I should have done this, I should have done that. And then getting into this part here, we're seeing something more specific. We're seeing the idea that there was an antipathy right here between myself and my employer. And that antipathy excluded the narrator from the sunshine of life and made the narrator feel like a plant growing in darkness out of the slimy walls of a well. So we've got the reflection in the beginning, the philosophical reflection, then the expressions of regret, and finally the specifics. The problem is that there was an antipathy between myself and my employer in line 29. So now let's start to differentiate between choices A, B, and D. A character describes his dislike for his new job and considers the reason why. Well, the reason why was the antipathy between himself and his employer, so I might leave that alone. Two characters became increasingly competitive. Maybe we'll leave that alone for now. And D, a new employee experiences optimism, frustration, and despair. Well, the problem with choice D is there's no optimism anywhere in what we just saw. So far we've narrowed out C and D. Notice how long it's taking for us to arrive at the answer here. If we had already done some of the easier questions, we might already be familiar with the place in the passage where they really announce the right answer to us. Getting a little deeper into the passage, Line 34, antipathy can express the feeling Crimsworth had for me, a feeling which was liable to be excited by every most trifling movement. My accent annoyed him, my education evinced and irritated him, my punctuality, industry, accuracy fixed his dislike, and gave it the high flavor and relish of envy. He feared that I should make a successful tradesman. So what's happening there? Well, we have the narrator's boss having antipathy for him. And that antipathy was going to be excited by every little movement. The accent annoyed him, the education evinced and irritated him, the punctuality, industry, and accuracy fixed his dislike, and gave it the relish of envy. He was the one who feared that I will make a successful tradesman. So the thing that's standing out the most in that section right there is the idea of the envy, and the boss fears that the narrator is going to become a successful tradesman. So what's happening right there? We're seeing a further definition of why B can't be right, because there are not two characters becoming competitive. Instead, it's just Edward Crimsworth who is experiencing all of this jealousy and envy of the narrator. So we've narrowed out B, C, and D, and the answer for number 1 is going to be A. Now we're going to question 2, and question 2 is all about the main purpose of the opening sentence of the passage. And the opening sentence of the passage is this sentence that I'm highlighting right here. It's a really long one that has a quote in it. And usually when we get line references, it helps to think of the line reference as the what, and the things directly before and or after that as the why. So another way to say that is it would be too easy if the answer came directly from the opening sentence of the passage. Instead, we would look right before or after. This is the first sentence in the passage, so it's going to be after. And that might shed some light on the significance of the sentence that they were asking us about. So, right here, we're seeing the beginning of the story itself. From the first week of my residence in this place, I felt my occupation irksome. The job itself was a dry and tedious task enough, but had that been all, I would have borne with it. I should have done this. I should not have done that. I should have done this other thing. So it's a story about not enjoying a person's job and being full of regret about all the different ways in which the person wishes that he had handled that initially. Now, what would be the purpose of the green sentence if directly after the green sentence we're getting the story and the fact that it's a story about regret? What we're getting in the green sentence is kind of a philosophical reflection on that. You know, it's in general, it's about humanity in general. No man likes to acknowledge that he's made a mistake, and every man will do anything before he allows himself to cry out, I'm baffled, I give up, right? So no man likes to admit that he's given up, and here's my story. So the first sentence, in my own words, I would say it's a philosophical reflection that's going to give us a little bit of a view into what is going to be explained right after. And the answer choice that matches that is going to be choice B. Provide a context useful in understanding the narrator's emotional state. Now looking at why some of the wrong answer choices are wrong. Choice A talks about a controversy, and there was no controversy. Choice C talks about symbolism. Now symbolism, even though choice C is a little tantalizing, I would still say that, well, what's symbolism? That would be using some kind of symbol. For instance, if the narrator considered himself an apple and Edward Crimsworth was an orange, so some symbol that represents the difference between them, that would be something symbolic. But because we're just talking about people and they are people, then I would say there are no symbols being used here. And choice D, contrast the narrator's good intentions with his malicious conduct. Well, there was no malicious conduct. There was nothing malicious happening on the part of the narrator. The malicious things that we end up seeing in the passage come from the other guy, Edward Crimsworth. So D is out, and the answer for number 2 is going to be B. Question number 3. During the course of the first paragraph, the narrator's focus shifts from what to what? Well, we already said in the past that the first sentence is a sentence that's kind of giving us a philosophical reflection on the story that's about to be told. So no man likes to acknowledge that he's made a mistake before he allows himself to cry out, I'm baffled, I give up. So no man likes to do that. Then begins the actual story. From my first week of my residence in X, I felt the occupation irksome. The job itself was dry and tedious, but had that been all, I would have borne with it. I would have endured. I should have spent every sigh. I should have set up this and that. So all the things that would have been done, or all the things that should have been done, all the expressions of regret right over here in line 26, imagination should never have severed me. So in other words, if the job was just dry and tedious in line 9, I would still have done all these things, or I would have had no problem continuing onward. But in line 27, this was not all. There was antipathy between myself and my employer, and it was spreading denser shade daily. It excluded me from every glimpse of the sunshine of life. I began to feel like a plant growing in humid darkness out of the slimy walls of a well. So now we have the actual presentation of what was really wrong. So there was a lot of kind of gradual building up to that. So just to review one more time, in blue here, we have a philosophical reflection on what's about to be told. In green, we have kind of a long introduction. Yes, I didn't like the job, but if that was the only problem, I would still have gone onward. I would have done this, I would have done that, I would have done the other thing. But then finally in line 27, what was really wrong is the issue I had with my employer who hated me. So just to reiterate, the passage starts with a very philosophical reflection. Then it goes on to a very general discussion of what the narrator would have done in similar circumstances. And finally, it goes on to the specific problem that happened in this story, which is that the narrator's employer had a thing against him. So this all matches choice C, generalization about job satisfaction to the specifics of his own situation. Question number 4. The references to shade and darkness at the end of the first paragraph mainly have which effect? So in the beginning, we have in blue, the philosophical reflection saying that no man likes to admit that he's baffled. Then in green, we have the idea that if the job were just a bad job, the narrator says, I should have still been okay. So the narrator's expression, perhaps, that under bad circumstances, that's not so much of a big deal for him. He normally would have still kept trying to do an okay job. And then we have in purple the specific explanation of what really was the problem. What was really the problem was the idea of the antipathy between myself and my employer that struck a deeper root and spread shade daily and excluded me from every glimpse of the sunshine of life. And I began to feel like a plant growing in darkness. So these words that we're seeing, particularly the shade and the darkness, are words that are kind of emphasizing really the dreariness of the whole thing. The fact that this terrible situation between the narrator and his employer really made him feel deep, terrible sadness, shade, darkness, like a plant growing on the slimy walls of a well. So this is a really sad situation, and in our own words, the references to shade and darkness are kind of emphasizing the sadness of it all. So the answer is A. They evoke the narrator's sense of dismay. The problem with choice B is sinister would kind of imply that the narrator was the evil one, which is not the case here. Fear of confinement, well, we're just not seeing a fear of confinement, maybe like a claustrophobia, anything like that going on. And in D, the narrator having a longing for rest. Once again, if there were a line that specifically said, I need some rest, I'm specifically tired, then that would be great, but we're just not seeing it in the passage. So the answer for number 4 is going to be A. Question number 5. The passage indicates that Edward Crimsworth's behavior was mainly caused by what? The thing to notice here is that with each question, we've been really forced to go section by section by section through the passage. So, little by little, we're going through a natural process of getting to know this passage better. If there were any really tough questions along the way, questions that really asked for a deep, thorough understanding of the passage, we would have wanted to skip those questions because, of course, after we've already gone section by section through the passage, then we would be much more capable of answering a question like that. So far in this passage, that tough question seems to be question 1, which is the one that basically said, what's this passage all about? So, assuming you were seeing this in a real SAT setting, you'd want to skip question 1 and come back to it later. Right now, this question is taking us to the next part of the passage, which is kind of telling us what was going on with Edward Crimsworth. So, antipathy is the only word which can express the feeling that Crimsworth had, a feeling which was liable to be excited by every little thing. The accent annoyed him. The degree of education evinced in my language irritated him. My punctuality, industry, accuracy fixed his dislike and gave it the high flavor and poignant relish of envy. He feared that I too should one day make a successful tradesman. So these two words that I highlighted here are not verbs like the others, but they're key words. This is really the point of what's being said here. Crimsworth was highly envious, highly jealous, and the reason why was because he had fear that the narrator was going to be more successful than him. So that all points directly to answer choice D. Crimsworth was experiencing jealousy of the narrator's apparent superiority. So the answer for number 5 is going to be D. Question number 6 says, the passage indicates that when the narrator began working for Crimsworth, he viewed Crimsworth how? So this question is really asking us to simply find a quote. There's going to be some quote somewhere in the passage that says how the narrator first viewed Crimsworth. One thing to notice is that this question is followed by an evidence-based question, and it begs the never-ending question, should you do the evidence questions first? And we strongly feel that you should not be doing the evidence questions first. If anything, what you can do is notice that all of the line numbers in question 7 start at 28 and end at 62. So we don't want to be going question by question through number 7 looking for the answer to number 6 for a couple of reasons. But you can tell yourself, well, I know the answers are coming from 28 to 62, and therefore kind of look in that area for the answer. Now, there are a couple of reasons why you don't want to answer the evidence question before you answer the question itself. Why in this situation you wouldn't want to answer question 7 before you answer question 6. One is that each of these quotes are kind of useless without a context. Each of those quotes are kind of the big moment that caps off a statement that was being made in that area. So the quotes in and of themselves are somewhat useless. The other big reason is that your ability to look through a passage and look for the relevant quotes that answer a question, those are kind of like muscles. Think of them as muscles, and you need to exercise those muscles. If you fully get to the point where you've exercised those muscles and you've gotten them to where they need to be, then you're ready to do your best on the SAT reading section. So you don't want to give up the opportunity to practice looking through the passage and looking for the quote that answers a specific question. In this situation, the quote that we're looking for is right around here in purple. I had long ceased to regard Mr. Crimsworth as my brother. He was a hard, grinding master. He wished to be an inexorable tyrant. That was all. So right there, we're seeing that right now, Crimsworth is a hard, grinding master, an inexorable tyrant. But he used to consider Mr. Crimsworth, the narrator used to consider Mr. Crimsworth as my brother, as his brother. But he had long ceased to regard him that way, so he no longer regards him that way. So taking that over to question 6 now, the passage indicates that when the narrator began working for Edward Crimsworth, he viewed Crimsworth as, in the words of the passage, a brother. A brother in the sense of being a family member, someone that perhaps he felt love for, someone who was definitely on the same team as him. And so that takes us to choice B. He considered him in the beginning a sympathetic ally, but now he ceased to regard him that way. Instead, he regarded him as the opposite, as a grinding master, as a tyrant. So one way we could see it is using the word brother. The other way is if he ceased to regard him as a brother, so now we're looking for opposites, he regarded him as the opposite, someone who is against him, a master, a tyrant, that was all. So, a harmless rival, some people might think of their siblings as a harmless rival, but that's not the way it was being expressed here, in particular because the opposite of the brother is a tyrant, a master, someone who was against the narrator. So if the opposite, if someone who was against you, then that means the original word was someone who was for you. So not a rival, but more of an ally. So the answer for number 6 is B. Now going to question 7, we're looking for the evidence. Well, we were looking in lines 61 to 62. I had long ceased to regard Mr. Crimsworth as my brother, and that is choice D. So the answer for number 7 is going to be D. And now we're going to question 8. At the end of the second paragraph, the comparisons of abstract qualities to a lynx and a snake have the effect of doing what? Let's go ahead and read that part of the passage. If he could have once placed me in a ridiculous or mortifying position, he would have forgiven me much. But I was guarded by 3 faculties, caution, tact, observation. And prowling and prying as was Edward's malignity, it could never baffle the lynx eyes of these, my natural sentinels. Day by day did his malice watch my tact, hoping it would sleep, prepared to steal, snake-like, on its slumber. But tact, if it be genuine, never sleeps. So we're seeing the idea that Edward Crimsworth was after him like a snake, prepared to steal, is what the passage says, on its slumber. So Crimsworth was like an evil villain lurking in the shadows, ready to leap on every opportunity. But the lynx is a metaphor that's being used to describe the idea of being on guard. My natural sentinels are the things that had the narrator on guard. And his malice watched my tact, but tact never sleeps. So tact being the idea of being on guard. And so while the snake was waiting to attack, the narrator was on guard and never slept, never let his guard down, and never let Edward Crimsworth take advantage of him. So in our own words, we're going to say that the metaphor of the lynx and the snake has the effect of emphasizing the antagonism between them. This was like a war, and they were both in the trenches, waiting to shoot each other out. And the answer choice that matches that is choice D, illustrating the nature of an adversarial relationship. Question number 9. The passage indicates that after a long day of work, the narrator found his living quarters to be what? So when we're looking for any keyword relating to the living quarters, that takes us over here to line 69. As I approached my lodgings, I churned from a general view of my affairs to the particular speculation as to whether my fire would be out. Looking toward the window of my sitting room, I saw no cheering red gleam. So the fire in the apartment or house was being used as a metaphor of optimism. So after a long day of thinking of this terrible situation between himself and his employer, now the narrator is walking home and says, let's forget about all that. Let's look and see if maybe at least my fire is still burning, for some kind of unrelated optimism. And to add even more depression to a depressing situation, that unrelated optimism is unfounded because the narrator says here in the last line of the passage, I saw no cheering red gleam. So, after a long day of work, the narrator found his living quarters to be dreary, lacking optimism, totally depressing. So the answer to number 9 is going to be B. Now for number 10, the place where we were looking at all of that was literally 68 to 74, so we can easily pick choice D for number 10. Before we go to question 11, we're going to read the passage that precedes questions 11 to 21. And this passage, to be honest, is the worst of the worst. It is just so dry, so boring. You really have to wonder what the writers of the SAT were thinking when they made today's high school students read a passage like this. Normally, to handle a tough passage, we would use verbs. We would use that method where we're depending on our verbs to understand what's going on. But this passage, I might say, is even tougher than that. So what I think we should just do is just go ahead and blow right through it, just get it over with. And unfortunately, that's something you have to do occasionally in the SAT, where some of the passages are just so that way, where They actually compare very closely to the story of Edward Crimsworth and his terrible employer who just made things so unbearable. Sometimes the SAT just gives us some of this language that we just have to get it over with. But one of the bright sides of this is I think I'm going to set out to prove here that you don't always need to feel like you're just totally on top of what you're reading, because the SAT is so evidence-based and we're just simply going to be looking at the line that proves the right answer for every single question. We really could have some moments where we don't feel great about what we're reading or about understanding the main idea of it, and we could really perfectly get through all of the questions without ever achieving that amazing feeling. So let's go ahead and demonstrate that at least. So we're going to just start reading here. The passage is adapted from Ian Kane, Can Economics Be Ethical? So we know it's about the ethics of economics, and I have a feeling when we're at the end of the passage, that's still all we're going to know. So recent debates about the economy have rediscovered the question, is that right? Where right means more than just profits or efficiency. Some argue because the free markets allow for personal choice, they're already ethical. Others have accepted the ethical critique and embraced corporate social responsibility. Before we can label any outcome as immoral or sneer at economists who try to put a price on being ethical, we need to be clear on what we're talking about. There are some views on where ethics should apply when someone makes a decision. Consider Adam Smith, regarded as the founder of economics. He was a moral philosopher who believed sympathy for voters was the basis for ethics. But one of his key insights was that acting on empathy could be counterproductive. He observed that people becoming better off when they put their own empathy aside and interacted in a self-interested way. Smith justifies selfish behavior by the outcome. Whenever planners use these analyses to justify something, or someone retrains to boost his or her earning power, or a shopper buys one to get one free, they're using the same approach, empathizing with someone and seeking an outcome that makes that person as well off as possible, although the person they're empathizing with may be themselves in the future. Instead of judging consequences, Aristotle said ethics was about having character, displaying virtues like courage. It is a view to put into practice whenever leaders are chosen for their character. But it's a hard philosophy to teach. Just how much loyalty should you show to a manufacturer that loses money? Show too little and you're greedy. Too much and you're wasting money. Aristotle thought there was a mean between the extremes, and finding it was a matter of fine judgment. If ethics is about character, it's not clear what those characteristics should be. There is yet another approach. Instead of rooting ethics in character or the consequences of actions, we can focus on the actions themselves. From this perspective, some things are right, some are wrong. We should buy fair trade goods, we shouldn't tell lies. Ethics becomes a list of commandments, do's and don'ts. When a finance official refuses to devalue currency because they promised not to, they're defining ethics this way. According to this approach, devaluation can still be bad. Many moral dilemmas arise when these versions pull in different directions, but clashes are not inevitable. Take fair trade coffee, for example. Buying it might have good consequences, be virtuous, and also be the right way to act in a flawed market. Common ground like this suggests that, even without agreement on where ethics applies, ethical economics is still possible. Whenever we feel queasy about perfect competitive markets, the problem is rooted in a phony concept of people. The model of man on which economics is based, an entirely rational and selfish being, is a parody, as John Stuart Mill accepted. Most people now accept this economic man is fiction. We behave like a herd, we fear losses more than we hope for gains. Rarely our brains can process all the relevant facts. These human quirks mean we can never make purely rational decisions. A new wave of economists, aided by neuroscientists, is trying to understand our psychology alone and in groups so they can anticipate our decisions in the marketplace. But psychology can help us understand why we react in disgust at economic injustice or accept a moral law as universal, which means that the relatively new science of behavior might also define ethics for us. Ethical economics would then emerge from one of the least likely places, economists themselves. So let's pat ourselves on the back for having even gone through that passage, and let's jump right into answering some questions. Question number 11 is asking us about the main purpose of the passage, and this is exactly the kind of question we might want to leave for later in a real SAT testing situation. Right now we're going to answer it in real time for the purpose of the video, but in a real SAT test, you probably would want to go question by question, getting more familiar with the passage, and at some point, there's going to come a moment where the real purpose of the passage is going to click for you, and at that moment, it probably would be more effective to come back and answer question 11. But for now, we can look in the title of the passage, Can Economics Be Ethical? And there's also the first line of the passage that says, recent debates about the economy have rediscovered the question, is that right? Where right means more than profits or efficiency. So in other words, ethics is coming up. The question of whether something is right or wrong, which is the idea of ethics, is coming up in economics. That's basically what's being said in lines 1 to 3. Then if we skip ahead to line 11, there are different views on where ethics should apply when someone makes an economic decision. So all three of the places that we just pointed out are all talking about the role of ethics in economics. And so that is going to go ahead and match up with choice D. Examine ways of evaluating the ethics of economics. Question 12 is a great example of how we often think the SAT wants us to think about certain things, but instead it's really asking us to point out quotes. So for instance, here the author is anticipating objections to criticizing the ethics of free markets. So where are we specifically seeing that, as opposed to reading the question and kind of thinking to ourselves, where might the author be thinking of doing something like this? Everything is super literal on the SAT. So there's a nice simple quote right toward the beginning. Some argue that. So what is the author doing right there? The author is pointing out the arguments of other people other than what the author himself is going to say. So some argue something. What is it that they argue? They argue that because free markets allow for personal choice, they are already ethical. So that directly matches answer choice D. Free markets are already ethical because they enable individuals to make choices. So nice and simple. Going over to question 13, asking us where we got the evidence to that question, and we got our evidence on lines 4 through 5, and so that's answer choice A, lines 4 through 5. Question 14 is our passage-based vocabulary question, and for these questions, what we always do is, number 1, we find the momentary main idea, and number 2, we invent a word to replace the given word on our own. This is before looking at the answer choices, because remember, those answer choices are not our friends. We want to know what we think the answer is always before looking to the answers that are provided for us. So for the momentary main idea, we just saw the part that said some argue that because the free markets allow for personal choice, they're already ethical. Others have accepted the ethical critique and have embraced corporate social responsibilities. So going into the passage, to get the momentary main idea, we see that some argue that because the free markets allow for personal choice, they're already ethical. Others have accepted the ethical critique and embraced corporate social responsibility. But before we can label any market outcome as immoral, we need to be clear on what we're talking about. So we have the word embraced, which is right here. We saw some say that markets are already ethical. Others have embraced corporate social responsibility. So in what way are they saying the word embraced? I might say in my own words, some have accepted the idea of corporate social responsibility. We went over the momentary main idea and we just spent some time understanding that. And then we invented our own word. Notice that I didn't invent a single word. A phrase is just as good. But which answer matches the idea of accepting an idea? That would be B. Readily adopted. So accepted the idea or readily adopted the idea mean the same thing. So the answer for 14 is B. Question 15 is asking us for the main purpose of the fifth paragraph. So looking through the fifth paragraph, it starts by saying, there is yet another approach. Instead of rooting ethics in character or the consequences of actions, we can focus on the actions themselves. So we're being introduced to, literally, another approach, and then the passage says a little bit more about it. From this perspective, some things are right, some are wrong. It kind of explains it a little, and then it criticizes it. Ethics, in this way of seeing things, becomes a list of do's and don'ts. And so, according to this approach, devaluation can be bad, even if it makes everyone better off. So right here, they're just kind of explaining a little further what would and would not be acceptable under this approach. But the whole paragraph is essentially telling us about an approach and making us familiar with it, which is choice C. It's describing a third approach to defining ethical economics. And so, according to the passage, we saw one approach right at the beginning, which is the approach that was given by Adam Smith, who believed that sympathy for others was the basis of ethics. So there's one big approach being explained there. And then there's the second big approach, which was, instead of judging consequences, Aristotle said ethics was about having the right character. So the second approach had to do with character. And then here we literally have the third approach, which we already talked about, which is the one that said we can root our ethics in the actions themselves. So literally the third approach, and the answer for 15 is C. Question 16 is our passage-based vocabulary, where we once again want to get the momentary main idea, and then we want to invent a word to replace the given word. So here, to get the momentary main idea, many moral dilemmas arise when these three versions pull in different directions, but clashes are not inevitable. So we're talking about ideas pulling in different directions, and if they go in different directions, they might clash with one another. So now if I'm inventing my own word, they might battle one another, they might hit one another. And so which word might match that? Well, brawl kind of sounds like it, but a brawl very specifically means a wild type of fight. A collision could be the word as well, so let's leave that one for now. A mismatch could be something a little bit different, because we already know that the versions pull in different directions. So in other words, they already don't match. So that was mentioned already. So it wouldn't make sense for them to mention it when they use the word clashes. So we can easily get rid of mismatches. And conflicts could be the word as well. So now, what's the difference between conflicts and collisions in this situation? Well, we're talking about different approaches to ethics. So what's going to happen to an approach to the ethics of economics? Different approaches might conflict with one another. So if we said battle or hit, that could lead us to A or C. But now we're really splitting hairs here between the two. And a collision might literally be a physical crashing into one another. Whereas we're not talking about physical things here, we're talking about ideas. So we'll go ahead and pick conflicts. The different ideas are possibly going to conflict with one another, but the passage says those conflicts are not inevitable, so they don't necessarily have to happen. And the answer for 16 is going to be A. Question 17. Which choice best supports the author's claim that there is common ground shared by the different approaches to ethics described in the passage? We already have dealt with the overall structure of the passage, which in the first paragraphs talks about just the overall idea of the ethics of economics. And paragraph by paragraph, starting on line 11, gives us 3 different paragraphs talking about 3 different approaches. So the idea that the 3 approaches are going to be shared with each other or have common ground, I don't think it's really likely to happen toward the beginning of the passage. So that's just my hunch, but we could be wrong. So let's look at the quote on 11 through 12. There are different views on where ethics should apply when someone makes an economic decision. So what we're seeing is the idea that there are different views, while what we're looking for is common ground. So literally, choice A is the opposite of what we're looking for. Going over to choice B, 47 to 50. 47 to 50 says, from this perspective, some things are right, some are wrong. We should buy fair trade goods. We shouldn't tell lies in advertisements. So here, we just simply have a sentence that's explaining a little bit about this approach, the third approach that's being explained in that paragraph. So we're just further explaining that approach, and we're not saying anything about common ground between the different approaches. So 59 to 64, take fair trade coffee, coffee that is sold with a certification that indicates the farmers and workers who produced it were paid a fair wage. For example, buying it might have good consequences, be virtuous, and also be the right way to act in a flawed market. So what's happening here is that having good consequences is describing the first outlook, being virtuous is describing the second outlook, And being the right way to act in a flawed market might be the third outlook. And let's go ahead and look at those detail by detail. So the first part of the quote talked about having good consequences. And the outlook that's described in this paragraph right here talks exactly about having good consequences. It says, Smith justifies selfish behavior by the outcome, by the consequences. So that is matching up with the first approach that we saw. The second approach in the quote is the idea of being virtuous. So this paragraph right here is describing the second approach, and the virtue is right there. Aristotle said ethics was about having the right character, displaying virtues. The third part of the quote is the idea of being the right way to act in a flawed market. So in other words, tolerating imperfection. And that's right here, because according to this approach, devaluation can be bad, even if it would make everyone better off. So according to that approach, devaluation makes everyone better off. So the market is very flawed, but people are acting the right way. Like it says in the quote on line 52, a finance official refuses to devalue a currency because they have promised not to. So they're acting the right way. They're acting ethically, even though the market is flawed, because devaluation is making everybody better off. So choice C lines up exactly perfectly with the passage. And so the common ground is that there's the same thing that's being bought. Buying this thing is going to do something that's in line with all three of the outlooks, and therefore the outlooks have common ground. So the answer choice for 17 is definitely going to be C. And just to quickly look at choice D, lines 75 to 77, we behave like a herd, we fear losses more than we hope for gains, rarely can our brains process the relevant facts. I don't see anything in there about the different approaches having common ground. So once again, the answer for 17 is C. Question 18 is asking us for the main idea of the final paragraph. The final paragraph is right here. It starts by saying, these human quirks mean that we can never make purely rational decisions. A new wave of behavioral economists, aided by neuroscientists, is trying to understand our psychology, both alone and in groups, so they can anticipate our decisions in the marketplace more accurately. But psychology can also help us understand why we react in disgust at economic injustice or accept a moral law as universal, which means that the relatively new science of human behavior might also define ethics for us. Ethical economics would then emerge from one of the least likely places, economists themselves. So here we're seeing a whole paragraph about how we can understand the same question as being asked throughout the passage through the idea of psychology. Psychology here, and here, human behavior, and how that might also define ethics for us. So that's going to lead us to answer choice C. And let's just spend a few moments talking about the other answer choices on this one, because we definitely saw a sentence on lines 78 to 79 that sounds a lot like answer choice A. But what is answer choice A talking about? It's talking about the idea of predicting. So the SAT is so literal that notice that the quote itself never says anything about predicting people's decisions. And so, therefore, while it seems to match the quote pretty perfectly, we're just not seeing anything about the idea of predicting, and so that one's not as good as C. Plus, what we're seeing in C was throughout the entire paragraph, not just the first sentence. Looking at choice B, people universally react with disgust when faced with economic injustice. Once again, we saw that right there, but it wasn't the main point of the paragraph. The main point was psychology is going to help us understand something like the idea that people react in disgust. So what we're seeing in the wrong answer choices is that they are taking the words from the paragraph, but they're not the main thing the paragraph is about. Going to answer choice D, economists themselves will be responsible for reforming the free market. Once again, we did see that right here. Ethical economics would then emerge from one of the least likely places, economists themselves. Now, although that was in the paragraph, it wasn't the main thing because this is an entire paragraph about psychology. So what you're going to want to do on a lot of these questions is make sure to answer the question in your own words first. Because if we were just trying on each answer choice for size without spending any time announcing to ourselves in our own words what this paragraph is about, we could easily have chosen answer choices A, B, or D because they all totally included things that were in the paragraph. However, they were not the main thing the paragraph was about. So the answer for 18 is going to be C. Question 19. Data in the graph about per pound coffee profits in Tanzania most strongly support which of the following statements? Well, before you get into a question about a graph or a table, what you really want to do is find out the overall trend on your own. It seems like it might be hard to do that, but although many of the graphs that are given on the SAT seem really complicated, they generally have simple overall trends. For instance, in this situation, we're seeing regular coffee profits compared to fair trade coffee profits. Looking at the two lines, we have regular profits down here consistently and fair trade coffee profits up here. So what's the overall trend of the graph? It's the idea that fair trade profits are much higher than regular coffee profits. And that exactly matches answer choice A. Fair trade coffee consistently earned greater profits than regular coffee earned. Going to question 20, data in the graph indicate that the greatest difference between per pound profits from fair trade coffee and those from regular coffee occurred during which period? So we're looking for the greatest difference between the two profit measures, and so that would be the greatest distance between the two lines. And quite clearly, the greatest distance between the two lines was in these two areas, so the area that I'm coloring in yellow, 2002, 2003, or 2004, and that's exactly what we're seeing in answer choice B for number 20. Question 21. Data in the graph provide most direct support for which idea in the passage? So what seems to be the idea of the graph? Once again, the overall trend. Fair trade coffee is creating more profits than regular coffee. So the idea is that when you act with ethics, you do better than when you act without ethics. And that might be answer choice C. Ethical economics is still possible in the sense that when you use ethics, you actually do well, you make good profits. Looking at the other answer choices, A says acting on empathy can be counterproductive. So in other words, having ethics is a bad thing. The graph clearly seems to be stating that acting on ethics is a good thing. So A is the opposite of what we're looking for. B says ethical economics is defined by character. Well, the graph is not telling us what defines ethical economics. It's telling us that ethical economics is beneficial. So it's just a little different than what we're seeing in the graph. And looking at answer choice D, people fear losses more than they hope for gains. So we don't really know what the motivations are for buying different types of coffee. We just know that fair trade coffee is earning more profits than regular coffee. So D is kind of taking it in a deeper direction than we're really able to do from this graph. So once again, the answer for 21 is going to be C. Before answering questions 22 to 32, we're going to read through the passage, being sure to always read the introduction at the beginning. And we're going to use the skipping words method because this passage doesn't look overly difficult. And it was written in 2010, which means it's fairly modern, so perhaps easy to read. So the introduction says, Passage 1 is adapted from Nicholas Carr. The web shatters focus, rewires brains. Passage 2 is from Steven Pinker, Mind over Mass Media. So one thing I know looking at the introduction is that passage 1 is very anti the web. It says that it shatters focus. It's against the effect that the web is having on our brains. So let's go ahead and start reading, skipping as many words as possible. The consequences of our online info crunching are not universally bad. Certain skills are strengthened by our use of computers and the net. These involve more primitive mental functions such as hand-eye coordination, reflexes, processing of visual cues. A study revealed that after 10 days of playing games on computers, a group of young people boosted the speed with which they could shift their focus between images and tasks. It's likely that web browsing also strengthens brain functions related to fast-paced problem solving, particularly when it requires spotting patterns. A study indicated that an experienced internet user can assess the trustworthiness and probable value of a web page in seconds. The more we practice surfing and scanning, the more adept our brain becomes at those tasks. But it would be a serious mistake to look narrowly at such benefits and conclude that the web is making us smarter. In an article, prominent psychologists reviewed more than 40 studies of intelligence and ability. She concluded that every medium develops some skills at the expense of others. Our growing use of the net and other technologies has led to widespread and sophisticated development of visual spatial skills, but those gains go hand in hand with a weakening of our capacity for deep processing that underpins mindful knowledge acquisition. We know that the human brain is highly plastic. Neurons and synapses change as circumstances change. When we adapt to a new cultural phenomenon, including the use of a new medium, we end up with a different brain. This means that our habits continue to reverberate in the workings of our brain cells even when we're not at a computer. We're exercising the circuits devoted to skimming and multitasking while ignoring those used for reading and deep thinking. So the biggest thing I noticed there is the idea that we end up with a different brain after we do certain activities. That's a very strong statement, so it definitely stood out to me. Looking at passage 2, critics of new media sometimes use science to press their case, citing research that shows experience can change the brain. So, by the way, we now know that the two passages are going against each other. But cognitive neuroscientists roll their eyes at such talk. Yes, every time we learn something, the wiring of the brain changes. It's not as if the information is stored in the pancreas. But this neuroplasticity doesn't mean the brain is a blob of clay pounded into shape by experience. Experience does not revamp the basic information processing capacities of the brain. Speed reading programs have long claimed to do just that, but the verdict was rendered by Woody Allen after he read Tolstoy in one sitting and said it was about Russia. Multitasking has been exposed as a myth, not just by lab studies, but by the sight of an SUV undulating between lanes. Moreover, the effects of experience are highly specific to the experience themselves. If you train people to do one thing, they get better at doing that thing, but almost nothing else. Music doesn't make you better at math. Conjugating Latin doesn't make you more logical. Brain training doesn't make you smarter. Accomplished people don't bulk up their brains with calisthenics. They immerse themselves in their fields. Novelists read lots of novels. Scientists read lots of science. The effect of consuming electronic media are likely to be far more limited. Media critics write as if the brain takes on the qualities of whatever it consumes, the informational equivalent of you are what you eat. As with ancient people who believed that eating fierce animals made them fierce, they assume that watching quick cuts in videos turns your mental life into quick cuts, or that reading bullet points and online postings turn your thoughts into bullet points and online postings. So if the first passage said that when you do certain activities, you end up with a different brain, this passage is saying those effects are likely to be far more limited than the panic implies. So let's go ahead and start answering some questions. Question 22. The author of passage 1 indicates which of the following about the use of screen-based technologies. Here, we need look no further than just the first line of the whole passage. The mental consequences of our online info crunching are not universally bad. It says certain skills are strengthened by our use of computers and the net. So right there, some good things, at least some good things happen as the result of screen-based technologies. So that's answer choice C. Screen-based technologies have some positive effects. Question 23 is asking us where we got our evidence to that question, and we looked on lines 1 to 4, and lines 3 to 4 is included in that, so the answer to 23 is going to be A. Question 24. The author of passage 1 indicates that becoming adept at using the internet can do what? So we're looking for a quote somewhere that says, when you become adept at using the internet, something's going to happen. So we see something about using the internet on line 13, web browsing, but we're not seeing anything about becoming adept. So let's move to the next paragraph. And in the next paragraph, we see the idea that it would be wrong to think that the web is making us smarter. So we see the web and we see improvement, so maybe we're getting warmer. So looking onward, every medium develops some cognitive skills at the expense of others. Seems like we're getting closer and closer. Our growing use of the net and other screen-based technologies has led to widespread and sophisticated development of visual spatial skills. So right there, we're seeing the idea that as you use the internet, you're seeing some improvement. So that seems to match the question a little more closely. going on further, but those gains go hand in hand with a weakening of our capacity for the kind of deep processing that underpins mindful knowledge acquisition, inductive analysis, critical thinking, imagination, and reflection. So as you get better from using the internet, you're also weakening your capacity for deep processing, among other things. And that matches answer choice B, undermine the ability to think deeply. So the more you use the internet, we're seeing around lines 34 to 38, that undermines your ability to think deeply. And the answer for 24 is going to be B. Question 25 is our passage-based vocabulary question where we want the momentary main idea, and then we want to invent a word to replace the given word. So we're looking for the word plastic in line 40. And so reading the passage there, we know that the human brain is highly plastic. Neurons and synapses change as circumstances change. So right there, the passage itself is defining what plastic means. It means that our neurons and synapses change as the circumstances change. So now that's the momentary main idea. And in our own words, we can replace plastic with changeable. So which of the given words can be used to mean changeable? Creative means coming up with new ideas. It doesn't mean changing. The creative person is not necessarily changing. The creative person is creating something. Artificial means fake. So being able to change and being fake, although they can be sometimes related, are actually different things. Malleable actually means changeable, but let's just say you didn't know the definition of that word yet. You could just leave it for later. And sculptural. What does sculptural mean? Well, from an artistic standpoint, a sculpture is the idea of removing pieces of usually a concrete block or a wooden block. So you're removing in order to create a sculpture. So that's a particular thing, a very special thing that artists can do, but it doesn't mean changeable once again, because something can be sculptural. That means that it is a sculpture. It's a sculptural type of art. It doesn't necessarily mean that something can change. So for instance, the statue of David that is a sculpture is not very changeable. It's going to always be the statue of David. So the answer for 25 is going to be C. If we didn't know the word malleable, we could get rid of the other three answer choices. Or if you do happen to know that word, it exactly means that. It means changeable, plastic, something that can easily kind of go with the flow and change forms. And once again, the answer for 25 is C. Question 26 is giving us a line reference. It's referring to Woody Allen reading War and Peace in one sitting, so we know where to look. But the area where we're looking is something we refer to as the what, and the area before and after it is what we refer to as the why. So let's look a little bit before and after. Before, we see the main idea of the paragraph. Experience does not revamp the basic information processing capacities of the brain. So here's the idea that the brain is not changeable. And so the Woody Allen example should be given to us as an example that the brain actually isn't changeable. So Woody Allen read Leo Tolstoy's famous novel and said it was about Russia. So in other words, Woody Allen didn't learn anything. He just knew it was about Russia. Looking on further, we see that genuine multitasking has also been exposed as a myth. So this is a paragraph about exposing myths, and so the Woody Allen example is exposing the myth that you could read a famously long novel in one sitting. In other words, the idea that speed reading is actually true. So now looking at the answer choices, was it that Woody Allen didn't like the writing style? No, it was about the idea that speed reading really doesn't work. Could not comprehend the novel by speed reading it? Well, that's exactly the idea that speed reading doesn't work. Had become quite skilled at multitasking. Well, he wasn't so skilled because all he came out knowing was that it was about Russia. And choice D, regretted having read the novel. Well, he said it was about Russia. He didn't say whether he regretted it or not. So that would be taking it a little far. And so the answer choice for 26 is going to be B. Question 27. According to the author of passage 2, what do novelists and scientists have in common? So the reference to novelists and scientists is pointing us to lines 79 to 80, but once again, The line reference itself tends to be the what, tends to be the place that we're looking, but the area right before and after it tends to be the why, the really important information, the stuff that we're really trying to find out. So what was being spoken about when the example of novelists and scientists came up? We were seeing on line 70, the effects of experience are specific to the experience themselves. If you train people to do one thing, they get better at that thing, but almost nothing else. Music doesn't make you better at math. Latin doesn't make you more logical. Brain training doesn't make you smarter. Accomplished people don't bulk up their brains with intellectual calisthenics. They immerse themselves in their fields. So right there, specifically, it's the idea that accomplished people don't bulk up their brains. They don't become smarter overall. They simply immerse themselves in their fields. Therefore, novelists read more novels. Scientists read more science. So, which answer matches what we just talked about? Choice D says exactly what we said on lines 78 to 79. Accomplished people immerse themselves in their fields, and choice D says they become absorbed in their own fields. So the answer for 27 is going to be D. Question 28. The analogy in the final sentence of passage 2 has primarily which effect? So we're looking at the final sentence of passage 2, but as we said earlier, the line reference itself is the what, the area right before and after it is the why. So we're going to go ahead and just start by reading the beginning of the paragraph, because chances are the area right before it is going to be the area where we find out why that particular quote is significant. So the effects of consuming electronic media are likely to be far more limited than the panic implies. Media critics write as if the brain takes on the qualities of whatever it consumes, the informational equivalent of you are what you eat. So far, the word that stood out to me was the word panic. So in other words, people who believe that doing different activities changes your brain are part of a panic. So in other words, the essay is referring to those people as exaggerated or just off base. Media critics write as if the brain takes on the qualities of whatever it consumes, the informational equivalent of you are what you eat. So it's comparing it to a phrase that's known to be kind of simplistic, like something that's told to children when we're trying to convince them to eat their breakfast. You are what you eat. As with ancient people who believe that eating fierce animals made them fierce, they assume that watching quick cuts and rock videos turns your mental life into quick cuts, or that reading bullet points and online postings turn your thoughts into bullet points and online postings. So what's happening here now? Instead of comparing it to some low-level phrase like you are what you eat, now we're hearing that it's being compared to ancient people who believed that eating fierce animals made them fierce. So in other words, some idea that's just totally ridiculous. And the idea that watching quick cuts on rock videos turns your mental life into quick cuts, or reading bullet points in online postings turn your thoughts into bullet points in online postings, is being compared to two ridiculous statements. You are what you eat, or eating fierce animals makes you fierce. So what's happening in our own words? We're seeing that the passage is ridiculing the idea that different activities you do actually change your brain. What's that doing? It's ridiculing the view of a particular group. That matches answer choice D. It's criticizing the view of a particular group by using really colorful metaphors. So the answer for 28 is going to be D. Question 29 is asking us the main purpose of each passage. And this is really interesting. We normally see this question toward the beginning, but now we're seeing it after we've already had ample opportunities to become really familiar with the different passages. So we can easily see now that we're deeply familiar with the passages, that the main idea of passage 1 is that, as passage 1 said around line 41, when we adapt to a new cultural phenomenon, including the use of a new medium, we end up with a different brain. So the main idea of passage 1 is activity fundamentally changes the brain. Now looking at passage 2, we're also deeply familiar with passage 2 at this point, and we can easily get the main idea of that one as well. The main idea of passage 2 is being stated right around lines 81 to 82. The effects of consuming electronic media are likely to be far more limited than the panic implies. In other words, activity doesn't fundamentally change the brain. So we have a nice, simple pro and con pair of passages. This all matches answer choice D, making an argument about the effects of electronic media use on the brain. Does that electronic media use change the brain, like passage 1 says, or does it not fundamentally change the brain, like passage 2 says? So the answer for 29 is D. Question 30 asks for the relationship between the two passages. So on question 29, we already had taken a stab in our own words at the main idea, the idea that passage 1 says activity fundamentally changes the brain, and passage 2 says activity doesn't fundamentally change the brain. So which answer choice can kind of match that? Well, A says passage 2 relates first-hand experience that contrasts with the clinical approach in passage 1. So we like the fact that they're contrasting, but the idea of first-hand experience doesn't necessarily work because the examples that we saw were Woody Allen reading War and Peace or an SUV undulating between lanes. So definitely not first-hand experience. Answer choice B, passage 2 critiques the conclusions drawn from the research in passage 1. So that's nice and simple, and it essentially says that they disagree with one another. So we can take answer choice B. Answer choice C, passage 2 takes a high-level view of a result that passage 1 examines in depth. So first of all, high level and in depth kind of sound like the same thing to me, and they're not really saying a whole lot of anything, and they're definitely not matching what we said in our own words. So far we've gotten rid of answer choices A and C, and answer choice D. Passage 2 predicts the negative reactions that the findings in passage 1 might produce. Sometimes it helps to imagine what would a passage like that sound like if we were predicting the negative reactions. That would sound something like, this other author made this claim, and once that claim gets out, people are going to be really upset. That would be the idea of predicting the negative reactions, which is absolutely not the relationship between the passages, and the answer for 30 is going to be B. Question 31 is a very difficult question because you'd really have to be deeply familiar with the passages to answer it quickly and effectively. So this might be one of the questions that you'd want to leave to the very end. The question asks, on which of the following points would the authors of both passages most likely agree? And the answer for this is going to end up being answer choice C, and I'm just going to go ahead and show you where both passages say things like that. In line 29, every medium develops some skills at the expense of others. Our use of the net and screen-based technologies has led to the widespread and sophisticated development of visual spatial skills, but those gains go hand in hand with a weakening of our capacity for deep processing. So while we're gaining the visual spatial skills, we're losing other abilities. So far we're seeing the idea that the visual spatial skills are not really helping us in other areas. In fact, we see that they're weakening us. The place where passage 2 agrees with this statement comes around line 70. The effects of experience are highly specific to the experiences themselves. If you train people to do one thing, recognize shapes, solve math puzzles, find hidden words, those are the visual spatial skills. They get better at doing that thing, but almost nothing else. So that exactly matches answer choice C. And so we saw both passages agreeing with that statement. And so we're done with question 31. Question 32. Which choice provides the best evidence that the author of passage 2 would agree to some extent with the claim attributed to Michael Merzenich in lines 41 to 43, passage 1? This is our question with lots of moving parts because you need to know what Michael Merzenich says in 41 to 43, passage 1, and then we need to find the evidence in passage 2 that agrees with that claim. So we need to take it little by little and stay organized. So let's go ahead and analyze the lines in 41 to 43 of passage 1. And the quote is right here in blue. It says, when we adapt to a new cultural phenomenon, including the use of a new medium, we end up with a different brain. So that quote basically is telling us that activity changes the brain. And where are we seeing anything in passage 2 that generally agrees with that statement? We're seeing it right on lines 54 to 56. Yes, every time we learn a fact or skill, the wiring of the brain changes. So the wiring of the brain does in fact change, So in a sense, you do end up with a different brain, although that's contrary to what the passage ends up arguing in the end. So the answer for 32 is going to be B, 54 to 56. Before we answer questions 33 to 42, we're going to go ahead and read through this passage. This is our antique passage. It was written in 1869. It's about women's suffrage, because we always read the introductory portion. And so, knowing that and just glancing through the passage, looking at how challenging it appears, we're going to go ahead and use the focusing on verbs method. So let's go ahead and get started. I urge the 16th Amendment because suffrage, or a man's government, is civil and social disorganization. The male element is a destructive force. See what a record of blood and cruelty the pages of history reveal. Through what slavery, slaughter, sacrifice, and so on, the soul of humanity has struggled for centuries, while mercy has veiled her face, and all hearts have been dead alike to love and hope. The male element has held high carnival thus far. It has fairly run riot from the beginning, overpowering the feminine element, until we know but little of true manhood and womanhood, of the latter comparatively nothing, for it has scarce been recognized as a power until the last century. Society is but the reflection of man himself. No one need wonder at the disorganization when we remember that man, who represents but half a complete being, has undertaken the absolute control of all matters. People object to the demands of those whom they choose to call strong-minded, because they say the right of suffrage will make the women masculine. That is just the difficulty in which we are involved today. Though disenfranchised, we have few women in the best sense. We have simply so many reflections, varieties, and dilutions of the masculine gender. The strong natural characteristics of womanhood are repressed and ignored in dependence. For so long as man feeds woman, she will try to please the giver and adapt herself. To keep a foothold in society, woman must be as near like man as possible, reflect his ideas, opinions, virtues. She must respect his statutes, though they strip her of every right and conflict with that higher law written by the finger of God on her own soul. Man has been molding women to his ideas by different influences, while she has used indirect means to control him, and in most cases developed the very characteristics both in him and herself that needed repression. And now man himself stands appalled at the results of his own excesses and mourns in bitterness that falsehood, selfishness, and violence are the law of life. The need of this hour is not territory, gold, railroads, or payments, but womanhood, to exalt purity, virtue, morality, religion, to lift man up into the higher realms. We ask women's enfranchisement as the first step toward the recognition of that essential element in government that can only secure the health, strength, and prosperity of the nation. Whatever is done to lift women to her true position will help to usher in a new day of peace and perfection for the race. In speaking of the masculine element, I do not wish to be understood to say that all men are hard, selfish, brutal. For many of the most beautiful spirits the world has known have been clothed with manhood. But I refer to those characteristics that distinguish what is called the stronger sex. For example, the love of acquisition and conquest, the very pioneers of civilization when expended on the earth, are powers of destruction when used to subjugate one man to another or to sacrifice nations to ambition. Here, that great conservator of women's love, if permitted to assert itself, as it naturally would hold all these destructive forces in check, for woman knows the cost of life better than man does, and not with her consent would one drop of blood ever be shed, one life sacrificed in vain. So, the passage here is talking about how the male element of violence and forcefulness has taken over the world, and how at that time in the world, what Stanton believes is that society, that the world needs the female element of gentleness and compassion. Question 33. The central problem that Stanton describes in the passage is that women have been what? So a question about the central problem in the passage is going to be a question that would be well answered after we're more deeply familiar with the passage. So, and like we keep saying, in a real SAT official testing setting, you may want to leave a question like this toward later after you've already become much more familiar with the passage. But all we need to do is look at the first paragraph to answer this question. I urge a 16th Amendment because manhood is civil, religious, and social disorganization. The male element is destructive. See what a record of blood and cruelty the pages of history reveal. So when men have been in control, we've seen lots of blood and cruelty. Through the slavery, slaughter, sacrifice, through what inquisitions and imprisonments, pains and persecution, black codes and gloomy creeds, the soul of humanity has struggled for centuries, while mercy has veiled her face, and all hearts have been dead alike to love and hope. So the passage talks about mercy and love and hope as female attributes, and is essentially saying that the world needs more of those attributes. So as we get into the second paragraph, the male element has held high carnival. It has run riot from the beginning, overpowering the female element everywhere, until we know but little of true manhood and womanhood. Of the latter, comparatively nothing, for it has scarce been recognized as a power until within the last century. So what are we seeing so far? We're seeing that in a male-controlled world, there's been all of this terrible stuff, destructive stuff, such as war, violence, conquest, acquisition, and persecutions, black codes, gloomy creeds, and mercy and love and hope, which are the female attributes according to this passage, have kind of been suffering. And later on, we're seeing the male element has held high carnival. It's run fairly riot from the beginning. It's overpowered the feminine element until we know little of true manhood and womanhood. So this situation that's been going on where men are in control has been causing problems where we know little about true manhood and womanhood. We know little about what's supposed to be the case. And all of this perfectly matches answer choice B, which says women have been prevented from exerting powerful positive influence on men, and that has led to societal breakdown. So the societal breakdown that we're seeing is lines 18 to 20. We know but little of true manhood and womanhood. So in other words, with men running the show, we've been totally confused about what's right and what's wrong in life and in the world. So the answer for 33 is going to be B. Question 34 is asking us about the phrase high carnival and what it emphasizes. So once again, the line reference itself is the what, and the area right before and after it is the why. So the good news is that right after this line reference, the passage itself defines what that means. The male element has held high carnival. It has fairly run riot from the beginning. It's overpowered the feminine element everywhere, crushing out all the diviner qualities in human nature until we know but little of true manhood and womanhood. So, what does it mean to hold high carnival? It means to overpower the feminine element everywhere. And that's what we mean by saying the area around the line reference is the why. In other words, it's that little area there that literally tells us what the phrase high carnival means. And so that matches answer choice A. There is an utter domination of women by men. Question 35. Stanton claims that which of the following was a relatively recent historical development? This is just pointing us toward a specific line. We can look through the whole passage looking for a statement that says that something was relatively recent, and where we see it is right around here. We see that womanhood has scarce been recognized as a power until within the last century. So what has happened relatively recently? The recognition of women as a power. So that's answer choice D, the acknowledgement of women's true character. So the answer for 35 is D. Now in question 36, we're looking for the evidence to that question, and we found that evidence in lines 20 to 22, which is going to be answer choice B. 15 to 22. So the answer for 36 is B. Question 37 is asking us about what is meant by the word rule in line 24. And so it's our passage-based vocabulary question where we want the momentary main idea, and then we want to invent our own word to replace the given word. So let's go ahead and read a little right around there. Society is but the reflection of man himself, untempered by woman's thought. So of course, the passage as a whole, especially in the beginning, is talking about how men have dominated society. So society is a reflection of man untempered by women's thought. The hard iron rule we feel alike in the church, the state, and at the home. So men are dominating, they're ruling. Men are taking over, and men are controlling everything. So that literally matches answer choice B for number 37. Question 38. It can reasonably be inferred that the strong-minded, line 32, was a term generally intended to do what? So the phrase strong-minded is right here, and let's read a little bit around it to find out what the purpose of that phrase was. People object to the demands of those whom they choose to call the strong-minded because they say the right of suffrage will make women masculine. So far, strong-minded is talking about women who want suffrage. That is just the difficulty in which we're involved today. Though enfranchised, we have few women in the best sense. We have simply so many reflections and dilutions of the masculine gender. So it's getting a little further into the argument right here about femininity versus masculinity. But right after the phrase strong-minded, we're seeing that it's the right of suffrage that's going to make women strong-minded or masculine. So it's being directly used to refer to women who want suffrage, who want voting in a derogatory manner, and that matches answer choice D. It's condemning women who agitate for the vote for their sex, because the right of suffrage means voting rights, and so that's a perfect answer for number 38. Question 39. As used in line 36, best most nearly means. That's our passage-based vocabulary where we want the momentary main idea, and then we want to invent a word to replace the given word. So the word best is right here, and what was happening at that moment. That is just the difficulty in which we're involved today. Though disenfranchised, we have few women in the best sense. We simply have so many reflections, varieties, and dilutions of the masculine gender. So we don't really have women in the truest sense. Instead, we have these reflections and dilutions of the masculine gender. So now, inventing a word in our own words, I might say we don't have women in the truest sense. Instead, we have all these versions of the masculine gender. So, which of these words might match truest? Well, that's C, genuine. So we don't have women in a genuine sense. We don't actually have women. Instead, we have all these versions of manhood. And so the answer for 39 is going to be C. Question 40. Stanton contends that the situation she describes in the passage has become so dire that even men have begun to do what? Well, there's enough of a description in the question itself for us to really know what to look for when we're speed reading through the passage, looking for a quote that fits. The quote that works is right here on line 53. And now man himself stands appalled at the results of his own excesses and mourns in bitterness that falsehood, selfishness, and violence are the law of life. So in our own words, we can say the quote is saying that even man himself is disgusted at the world that he had created. So that matches exactly answer choice A. Even men have begun to lament the problems they've created. And the answer to 40 is A. Question 41 is asking us for the evidence that we looked toward when we picked our answer for question 40, and the evidence we were using was in lines 53 to 55, and so the answer for 41 is nice and easy. It's going to be answer choice B. Question 42 is asking us the primary contrast in the paragraph from lines 67 to 78. So let's start reading the paragraph. In speaking of the masculine element, I do not wish to be understood to say that all men are hard, selfish, brutal, for many of the most beautiful spirits the world has known have been clothed with manhood. But I refer to those characteristics, often marked in women, that distinguish what is called the stronger sex. For example, the love of acquisition and conquest, the very pioneers of civilization, when expended on the earth, sea, the elements, the riches, the forces of nature, are powers of destruction when used to subjugate one man to another or to sacrifice nations to ambition. So a little closer to the beginning of the paragraph, in speaking of the masculine element, I do not wish to be understood to say that all men are that way, but I refer to those characteristics. So the passage is saying that it's not the men that are being referred to, but instead their characteristics, their traits. And that's answer choice D. There's a contrast between men and masculine traits. Before we answer questions 43 to 52, we're going to go ahead and read through the passage. We're going to use the skipping words method, the nice easy method that we'll use on most passages, because this is not an overly challenging passage like some of the other things we've been seeing. So let's go ahead and start by reading the introduction. Never forget to read the introduction. Long a mystery, how 500-meter high undersea waves form is revealed. 2014 Scientific American. So let's go ahead and start reading. Some of the largest ocean waves in the world are nearly impossible to see. Unlike large waves, these other waves do not ride the ocean surface. Instead, they move underwater, undetectable, without the use of satellite imagery or monitoring equipment. Despite their hidden nature, internal waves are fundamental parts of ocean dynamics, transferring heat to ocean depths and bringing up cold water from below. And they can reach staggering heights, as tall as skyscrapers. Because these waves are involved in ocean mixing and transfer of heat, understanding them is crucial to global climate modeling. Most models will fail to take internal waves into account. If we want to have more and more accurate climate models, we have to be able to capture processes such as this. Peacock and his colleagues try to do just that. Their study focused on internal waves generated in the Luzon Strait, near Taiwan and the Philippines. Internal waves in this region, thought to be some of the largest in the world, can reach about 500 meters high. That's the same as the Freedom Tower that's just been built in New York. Although scientists knew of this phenomenon, they didn't know exactly how the waves formed. To find out, Peacock and a team of researchers worked with France's National Center using a giant facility there called Coriolis Platform. The rotating platform, about 15 meters in diameter, churns at variable speeds and can simulate Earth's rotation. It also has walls, which means scientists can fill it with water and create accurate large-scale simulations of various oceanographic scenarios. Peacock and his team built a carbon fiber resin scale model of the Luzon Strait, including the islands and surrounding ocean floor topography. Then they filled the platform with water to replicate the different densities found at the strait. Small particles were added and illuminated with lights in order to track how the liquid moved. Finally, they recreated tiles using plungers. The Luzon Strait's underwater topography turns out to be responsible for generating the underwater waves. As the tide rises and falls, colder, denser water is pushed over the ridges into warmer, less dense layers above it. This results in bumps of colder water. As these waves move toward land, they become steeper, much the same way waves at the beach become taller before they hit shore, until they break on a continental shelf. The researchers were able to devise a mathematical model that describes the movement and formation of the waves. Whereas the model is specific to Luzon Strait, it can still help researchers understand how internal waves are generated in other places. Eventually, this information will be incorporated into global models, making them more accurate. It's very clear within the context of these models that internal waves play a role in driving ocean circulations, Peacock says. Question 43. The first paragraph serves mainly to do what? Let's go ahead and focus on verbs so that we can get a nice clear understanding of what this paragraph does. Some of the largest ocean waves in the world are impossible to see. Unlike other large waves, these rollers do not ride the ocean surface. Instead, they move underwater undetectable. Despite their hidden nature, these waves are fundamental parts of ocean water dynamics. They can reach staggering heights, some as tall as skyscrapers. So what's happening here? We're seeing an introduction to what an underwater wave is, and just a little introduction to little things we may not have known about them. We also see a little bit about their importance. These waves are fundamental parts of water dynamics. They can reach amazing heights, so they're much more important and much more amazingly large than we may imagine. So this all totally matches answer choice C. Describe a natural phenomenon and address its importance. Question 44. As used in line 19, capture is closest in meaning to what? This is a nice passage-based vocab question, and for passage-based vocab questions, we want our momentary main idea, and then we want to create our own word. We want to invent our own word to replace the given word. So for the momentary main idea, let's just read the paragraph. These waves are involved in ocean mixing. Understanding them is crucial to global climate modeling. Most models fail to take internal waves into account. If we want to have more and more accurate climate models, we have to be able to capture processes such as this. So the paragraph is talking about global climate modeling, and most models fail to take these waves into account. But if we want to have more accurate models, we must be able to capture processes such as this. So in my own words, I might invent a word to replace capture, and the word I might invent would be the word document. We need to be able to document processes such as this. And so to control something is different than documenting it. Documenting it is like writing it down. To record, well, record is like writing something down. I might record data, I might record information, not in the sense of record like we normally think of with radios or stereos, but record as in to record data. To secure processes, well, we're not securing the process. We're not making sure the process happens. We're not providing security for it. Instead, we're just writing down, recording information about it. And to absorb processes, well, to absorb is just totally different than what we're looking for. We're looking for documenting it, writing it down, creating records of it. And so the answer for 44 is going to be B. Question 45 is followed by an evidence-based question. So once again, we don't want to look at 46 too much before 45. But what we can do is notice that all the given quotes are coming between lines 1 and lines 26. So it wouldn't make any sense here to be looking around lines 60 or 80 for the information that we need. So according to Peacock, the ability to monitor internal waves is significant. Why? Well, right here, starting around line 12, it says, because the waves are involved in ocean mixing and the transfer of heat, understanding them is crucial to global climate modeling. Most models fail to take internal waves into account. If we want to have more accurate climate models, we have to be able to capture processes such as this. So, in our own words, the ability to monitor internal waves is significant because it'll help us to create better climate models. And that exactly matches answer choice D. The study of such waves will inform the development of key scientific models. So when we found that answer, we looked at quotes in lines 13 to 19. And so we can go ahead and pick C, lines 17 to 19. And that's the quote that says, if we want to have more and more accurate climate models, we have to be able to capture processes such as this. So the answer to 46 is going to be C. Question 47 is going to be our passage-based vocabulary question, where we want our momentary main idea, and then we want to invent our own word to replace the given word. So in line 65, we're seeing the word devise, and let's go ahead and get the momentary main idea. The researchers were able to devise a mathematical model that describes the movement and formation of these waves. So in my own words, I would say the researchers were able to create a mathematical model. And coincidentally, that perfectly matches answer choice A, and that was not done on purpose. Question 48. Based on the information in the passage, it can reasonably be inferred that all internal waves are what? So, I think that is a reference to the quote on line 65. The researchers were also able to devise a mathematical model that describes the movement and formation of these waves. Whereas the model is specific to the Luzon Strait, it can still help researchers understand how internal waves are generated in other places around the world. So although the model that they used referred to a specific body of water, it was going to help shed light on similar situations all around the world. So all internal waves are caused by similar factors, and we know that because the same model can be used to be reflected on waves generated in other places all around the world. Now, where do we see the bit about being influenced by the distinct topographies of different regions? One place we see it is around line 53. The Luzon Strait's underwater topography with a distinctive double ridge shape turns out to be responsible for generating the underwater waves. So the distinctive topography, the underwater hills and mountains, were responsible for the waves, and that holds true for any area. They all will have their own distinctive topographies. So the models can be used to reflect to situations all around the world, which means they're all caused by similar factors, but the specific shapes of the underwater areas are things that cause the differences between them. And so the answer choice for 48 that works is going to be B. Question 49 asks us for the evidence that we picked when we answered question 48, and we were looking at the purple quote on lines 67 to 70, and that's answer choice D, so the answer for 49 is going to be D. Question 50. In the graph, which isotherm displays an increase in depth below the surface during the period 1912 to 2024? So 1912 to 2024 is the little region between these two lines, and the confusing thing around this question is that an increase in depth means that we're moving downward. So which of these graphs is moving downward in that time period? It's this one right here, which is the 13 degrees Celsius, so therefore the answer to 50 is going to be D. Question 51. Which concept is supported by the passage and by the information in the graph? Well, looking at the graph, we see the idea that all of these internal waves only exist at a depth below 0. So, these internal waves do not rise to break the ocean's surface. Now, where do we see that in the passage? We see it right toward the beginning of the passage. Unlike other large waves, these rollers, called internal waves, do not ride the ocean's surface. Instead, they move underwater. So the graph and the passage on lines 2 through 4 both confirm answer choice D for number 51. Question 52. How does the graph support the author's point that internal waves affect ocean water dynamics? Well, the thing that I'm noticing when I look at this graph is that, for instance, we have the 13 degrees Celsius here, then we have 11 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Celsius, and 9 degrees. So we're getting colder as we're getting deeper, which makes logical sense. So let's take the warmest water in all of that, and this warm water is being dragged deeper. So that right there matches answer choice A. This demonstrates that wave movement forces warmer water down to depths that are typically colder. So the answer for 52 is A. Thank you so much for listening to our answer solutions. Grateful provides online one-on-one SAT, ACT, and PSAT tutoring to students all around the world with a novel approach that's been developed after thousands of hours with real students focused on the SAT. We believe that this approach would help you to maximize your possible score on the SAT or ACT. If you're interested in pursuing tutoring with Grateful, feel free to reach out. Have a great day.